It's a passage about the trial of Jesus. It's a relatively long passage, and I can really only scratch the surface a bit in the time available. So can I encourage everyone to make a point of reading these chapters over the Easter period and taking time to reflect on them. So we're in Luke 22 towards the end and into to Luke 23. Now you'll have noticed that the phrase that I mentioned doesn't actually appear in this passage where Pontius Pilate says, "What shall I do with Jesus who's called Christ?" That's an older translation, which is called Christ, but it's "What shall I do with Jesus?" And if we just take that as our text, what shall I do with Jesus? Because that's a question that faces every human being in the world today. And it's, as I said, it's the most important question. If you look up on your computer, what's the most important question? I wonder what you think would come back at you. One of them that you might expect is there life after death? That comes back as one of the most important questions. Is there alien life out there? Comes back as one of the most important questions. But I would suggest that this is the most important question that faces all of us. What shall I do with Jesus? It's a slightly different scenario than what faced Pontius Pilate, but what shall I do with Jesus is the important question. If we could just move on to the next slide there. Pontius Pilate, I think that's him from the Passion of the Christ, I think. I don't know. I think that's the actor who played him, so we don't know what he looked like. But we do know that Pontius Pilate was a real person. As I hinted at earlier on, I meet people now who tell me that there's no real historical evidence for the Bible stories of the New Testament and that they were invented some hundreds of years afterwards. And that's not a good thing to say. And I actually had that conversation not so long ago. And I replied, why do you not approach these things with the same rigor you would everything else? Because it's very clear that there is very good historical evidence for Pontius Pilate. So if we just show the next slide, this is a quote from the Annals of Tacitus, who's a Roman senator. He was writing about the fire in Rome, which was probably believed to have been orchestrated by the Emperor Nero, and he blamed Christians for it and made them scapegoats. You've probably heard that phrase that about Nero playing the fiddle as Rome burned, which may or may not be true, but clearly this, if you read the bit at the top, Christus, or Christ, from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, must refer to crucifixion, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, I actually called him, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. I don't think you have to be too wise to recognize that that's the resurrection of Jesus Christ that's being referred to. But clearly in a writing of the time, Pontius Pilate is mentioned. The crucifixion of Jesus is mentioned as well. So very clear. And then another one as well, the next slide. So I don't know how many people have been to Israel before, but if you go to Israel and you visit Caesarea, you can see this inscription referring to Pilate, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. You can see at the bottom there that despite everything else, critics doubted the existence of Pilate until extensive archaeological evidence confirmed him. So Pilate's a real person who was around, was governor. And I know that we think of prefects as people who told you to go out of school at lunchtime and you weren't allowed to sit inside in the rain. But prefect in a Roman culture was a governor or ruler. So Pontius Pilate, you can see the evidence that he existed. And the Romans, of course, were rulers of the area at that time. But the chief priests and the religious leaders liked to think that they were still in charge. So if we go on to the next slide and we'll come into the first main player. So what shall I do with Jesus who's called Christ? And I said we all have to make a choice on that question. So let's come to the Jewish religious leaders. That's the next slide there. the religious council. Again, just a picture, if you can see it there, of Jesus before the religious council. He's been taken for trial. We heard in previous weeks about the arrest of Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane, and then we heard about Peter's denial of Jesus, and now he's been brought before the religious council. And just the next slide. So the religious leaders of the day hated Jesus and wanted him dead. And that, I mean, you might think that's staggering. These were the people who held themselves up as the religious leaders of the day. And Jesus' greatest condemnation was for these people. They actually put up barriers and kept people away from God. They really believed in keeping the rules. And the hypocrisy of that is very much apparent in what happened here. Because what they did was they put Jesus on trial and broke almost every rule that applied to them as they put Jesus on trial. They used bribery and lies as well. So Judas Iscariot was bribed. I think it's very likely there were other people bribed, which we'll come back to. So they disregarded their own rules. Actually, if you go into the detail, you can find that they disregarded 20 of their own rules regarding how you conduct a trial. And just to give you an example of some of those trials, you were not allowed to conduct a trial during the night. So they broke that rule to try Jesus and to condemn him to death in a way without making it too public. There's other passages in the Bible where it says the religious leaders wanted to get rid of Jesus, but they feared the people. They also had a trial in the house of the high priest. You'll see two names mentioned. There's Annas and Caiaphas. Again, both historical figures. And they were two of the leaders. Caiaphas was really the chief priest at the time. And his father-in-law was Annas, who was also a chief priest before him. And he was tried in a house, which again was not allowed. The prosecution made the arrest, which again is not allowed. There was no witnesses or defense presented. Again, that was not allowed. The list just goes on and on of how the hypocrisy is so apparent. So the very people who insisted that everyone kept every I dotted and every T crossed in their rules and kept them away from God, when it came to the trial of Jesus, they disregarded every single rule that they could. And we do see the greatest injustice ever. Again, if you think of the miscarriages of justice, there have been many in the past, but this is the greatest miscarriage of justice ever. And because the man who was condemned was innocent of everything and completely innocent and perfect. Just that phrase is very sad indeed. Would not believe and then could not believe. If you notice in the Bible, when in that passage we read, whenever they question Jesus, Jesus says, "I would say this to you, but you would not believe." So he says you've decided you're not going to believe. And that's a very sad situation to be in, to decide that you will not believe. And unfortunately, that leads to the second one. When you make a decision that you won't believe, you then reach the point where you can't. And just to dip out of the passage today, because if you think a lot of what you read in the Gospels, a lot of it happened over the run-up to Easter. So a lot of the things that we have recorded in the Gospels are the end part of Jesus' life. So the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead, which you can read about in John chapter 11, was very close to when Jesus went to Jerusalem and when he was crucified. And if you think about what happened in that incident, it was astonishing. A dead man that everyone thought that there would be a stink of rotten flesh, Jesus calls him back out of the tomb. And to witness that must just have been astonishing. But what you read afterwards is not that the religious leaders were awestruck in wonder at the resurrection of a dead man. What they did was they made plans to kill Jesus when they saw that. And that just really makes the point, doesn't it? They would not believe despite what they were confronted with, and then they could not believe. So it's a very, as we come back to our initial question, what shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ? So there was one group of people with influence here who hated Jesus and refused to believe. No matter what, they weren't going to believe. They had decided, we will not believe in this man. We want to get rid of him. And is that influence still around today? Are there those who hate Jesus? Jesus said that to his followers, there will be people who hate you just as they hated me. And we've seen terrible persecution of Christians in places around the world. So that hatred still exists today. Okay? So that's one group of people of influence, those who hated Jesus. The next one. Herod Antipas. Need to know a little bit about our Herods. It wasn't fair to ask Mark a question because both answers were right, because Herod the Great tried to silence Jesus as well by getting rid of him with the murder of the innocents in Bethlehem. So he certainly tried to silence the voice of God as well. But that's when you ask a difficult question, that's one of the things you do. You make all the answers possibly right, make it even harder. So Herod Antipas is the one in this story. So Herod Antipas is the next generation down from Herod the Great. So Herod the Great was a nasty piece of work, and Herod Antipas is infamous as well. I haven't time to read the story or to go over the story of the murder of John the Baptist, but some of you will know it. So Herod Antipas was the king, allowed to be king by the Romans of mostly the Galilee area, and he arrested John the Baptist. John the Baptist particularly annoyed him because John the Baptist's message was one of repentance and judgment. And what Herod had done was he had married his brother's wife. So he had a relationship with his brother's wife. She was called Herodias. And John the Baptist pointed out publicly that this was wrong. So Herod Antipas was upset that this was being called out publicly, so he had John the Baptist arrested. The story of John the Baptist's murder is particularly unpleasant. So Herodias had a daughter, and the Bible doesn't name her, but Josephus, the Jewish writer, names her as Salome, or Salome, Salome. She danced at a feast, and Herod Antipas was much impressed and offered her anything that she wanted. And she said she would like the head of John the Baptist on a plate. So an executioner was sent down, and John the Baptist was beheaded, and the head was brought up to that drunken feast. Really a very sordid and unpleasant story. And that's why I say when Jesus was brought before Herod, we read here in the passage that Herod wanted to, had heard a lot about Jesus, wanted to see if he would do miracles for him, asked him, plied him with questions, and Jesus said nothing. Jesus didn't answer him at all. And I think Jesus considered that what he had done meant that he had silenced anything that Jesus had to say to him. So he had silenced the voice of God through his murder of John the Baptist. You can read these accounts again, and just Jesus' reaction to when he heard about the murder of John the Baptist is also something to read as well. And the comments that Jesus makes about John the Baptist. So part of the trial of Jesus, Pilate discovered through the process that Jesus was from Galilee. So he sent him off to Herod Antipas to see if Herod would give some verdict on what he should do with Jesus. And of course, Pilate, as we read in the passage, couldn't really find any fault with Jesus and wanted to release him. So in a sense, he was asking for another opinion from Herod. If you noticed in the passage, it says that as a result of this, Pilate and Herod became friends that day. The other part that you'll probably notice that Herod also mocked Jesus and put him in a robe, and there was part of the mocking process. Although Herod Antipas' jurisdiction was largely Galilee, the time of year was when everyone gathered in Jerusalem. It was the time coming up to Passover. So it was thought to be only a 10-minute walk from where Jesus was being tried by Pilate to where Herod was. So this is all happening at the same, over the same night into daybreak. Okay, so the influence of those who want to silence the voice of God. So if we just come back to Herod Antipas, we've said there's an influence in our world of those who hate Jesus. As we come to make our own decision of what we'll do with Jesus, we've said there's those who hate Jesus. There's those who want to silence the voice of God. Now, these are people who wouldn't say that they hate Jesus or hate Christianity, but that, I think if you look around, you can see that influence even in our own world and in our own society. There's those who want the Christian message to be silenced. I'll leave that with you to see where you think you can see that influence, but I think you can still see it today. Okay, now the next slide takes us to the crowd. So a lot's been said about the crowd. One of the things to point out is, if I haven't been to Israel yet, but if you hear about this place where this took place, it says that at 100 to 200 people would have seemed like a large amount of people in the space that was there. So this wasn't a crowd of tens of thousands of people. And just remember the time of day as well. This is kind of happening at daybreak. So most people are still asleep. And the religious leaders had a desire to condemn and get rid of Jesus before the city woke up. And there's likely to have been a combination of people planted by the religious leaders, possibly zealots. You'll come across Barabbas in the story. We sometimes say how a week before this, on Palm Sunday, we'll be thinking about Palm Sunday next Sunday. If you remember the story, the people cheered Jesus and shouted, Hosanna. And one of the things we sometimes think is this: the same crowd that shouted Hosanna then shouted crucify. We don't know that it was all the same crowd. There may have been some people who were in both crowds. Some of them may have been different. But it just makes the point that this wasn't a vast crowd of tens of thousands. This was a crowd probably of a few hundred. Were the crowd accountable for what happened? They certainly played a part in it. Pilate, as we read, found no fault in Jesus and wanted to release him. And the crowd were whipped up to a frenzy and shouted, crucify him, crucify him. So Pilate was certainly influenced by the crowd. So the crowd did have an influence that day. So I think that comes back to us all as we make the decision of what we will do with Jesus, who's called Christ. How much are we influenced by the crowd? If you do a sort of a poll, most people, I say a lot of people do have a respect for Jesus in our nation and for what he stands for. So there is some respect around. A lot of people will say, though, to live your life, eat, drink, and be merry. That often is the message of the crowd, and there is certainly an influence of the crowd. But if you come back to the decision, it's an individual one. It's a decision that you will one day stand by on your own, and the crowd will not be there when you give an account for that decision that you have made. What did you think of Jesus, who is called the Christ? So we've had the chief priests and the religious leaders who hated Jesus. We've then had Herod, who silenced the voice of God. And then we've got the influence of the crowd here. It really was not a good influence. The crowd shouted, crucify him. Just have the next slide. The other character who comes out here is Barabbas. So Barabbas was a revolutionary probably, but in this passage he's mentioned as being a murderer. And it was the custom at that time at the time of the religious holiday, to release someone who was a prisoner to be released. And I think Pilate hoped that this would solve the situation if the people asked for Jesus to be released as this goodwill gesture. And Pilate saw this as a way out. So again, there was a choice to be made, and the people chose Barabbas and not Jesus. They asked for Barabbas to be released, and they shouted for the murderer Barabbas to be released. There's a small imagery of Barabbas because in a way it's an image of the sacrifice of Jesus and what it means to everyone, because the sacrifice of Jesus and the fact that he took the sin of the world means that everyone else can go free. And in Barabbas going free, you see some imagery of that. And again, when we come back to what will we do with Jesus, who is called the Christ, sometimes there is a choice to be made. So whenever we say about choosing to serve and to follow Jesus, as we've mentioned already, one part of it is that Jesus on the cross will have paid the price for our sin, but he also asks us or commands us to follow him, and it has implications for how we live our life. So there is a choice to be made. So some people may choose a different way of life. They may choose things like materialism or other things, and they don't want Jesus to be the one who is in charge of their life, and that is what he expects if he is chosen as Lord of your life. So each of us must make a choice about Jesus. If you choose something or someone else, you have rejected Jesus. Jesus himself said, "He who is not for me is against me." And if you choose not to decide, if you choose to ignore Jesus, you still have made a choice to reject Jesus. So the question comes back, you must make a choice. Very sadly, Pontius Pilate made the wrong choice. He thought, as it says at the bottom, that he wasn't the one making a decision, but he was the man who handed Jesus over then to be crucified. So in almost not making a decision, Pilate by default rejected Jesus and sent him to the cross. Okay, just the next slide. Okay, so that brings us back to that question that faced Pontius Pilate at the trial of Jesus. What will you do with Jesus, who is called Christ? So Jesus was taken to be crucified. I said we haven't had time to consider some of the detail. The scourging or whipping and that was conducted in those days, there were two types, and the type that was done before crucifixion was really something that left the person almost dead. It was a terrible thing, and Jesus was then taken to be crucified at about 9 in the morning. So it shows you that all these events happened really overnight, and the decision to condemn Jesus to death was taken in the morning, just all as the city would have been wakening up and people were starting to go about their usual activities. You can see the whole thing was orchestrated. The accusations were false. The religious leaders broke all of their own rules. And of course, as we all know, the injustice was overturned 3 days later when Jesus rose in power and is now seated in heaven in great glory. So the injustice was, of course, overturned. But the cross was no accident. Even as the chief priests thought that they were orchestrating events, God had foreordained that Jesus Christ would die for the sins of the world. We're going to sing a song in a moment, and these are just some of the words that are found in it. This, the power of the cross. Christ became sin for us. What a love, what a cost. I stand forgiven at the cross. So in a way, we've kind of apportioned some of the blame for the cross with the religious leaders who stand condemned for their false accusations and for the way that they hated Jesus and broke all their own rules to condemn him. We see Herod Antipas. We see the crowd who shouted, "Crucify." And then what about us? And you say, well, what happened 2,000 years ago was nothing to do with you and me. And yet the Bible makes it clear that these events happened because of our sin. So the reason that Jesus went to the cross was because of your sin and my sin. And that phrase, "I stand forgiven at the cross." So these events are significant for all of us. As we look back and read the history and reflect on it, we realize that Jesus did it for love, and he did it for you, and he did it for me. So it leaves us all with a question: what will you do with Jesus, who is called Christ? And what we're going to do is just take a minute to reflect on that, and then we're going to sing the song. Once you get home this afternoon, something else will seem more important. Maybe the football will seem more important, or whatever you watch on a Sunday night will seem more important. But this is the most important question that all of us face. What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? And as we've mentioned, there's a significance to how we answer that question, and it dictates the direction that our life goes from when we make that choice. And we just pray that God will help us to make the right choice. Pontius Pilate had a long period of regret, which is still going on for what happened. We don't have it accurately recorded in historical texts, but tradition tells us that Pontius Pilate died a few years after these events, that actually he became very mentally unstable after the events of Jesus' trial and died fairly soon after. You also know the story that he washed his hands as if saying that he wasn't guilty of those events. But the consequences of the decision are so important. We all have to make a choice. Father, we thank you for the cross. We thank you for the sacrifice of Jesus. We thank you for what he has done for each one of us. We thank you for the significance of those events. We just pray that your Spirit would speak to each person here. We just pray you'd help us to each make the right choice about Jesus, who he is, and what he has done. We think of this song that we're about to sing, where the words say, tried by sinful men, scorned and beaten, then nailed to a cross of wood. This is the power of the cross. Christ became sin for us. We thank you for all that he has done. We thank you for your goodness to each of us through the cross. And we do pray that you would help each one of us to make the right choice in answer to that question, which still echoes today: what shall I do with Jesus?